Welcome to this new session of Cloud World. My name is Santiago. So, as promised in this next session, we are going to be talking about managed identities. So, after creating our Kubernetes cluster and having ready for deployment, we will need to talk about this topic first. But in order to understand what is a managed identity, we need to understand the concept behind it. So, if you have been developing applications for a while, you will already know that it's pretty common that when you have an API or a web application and you need to connect, for example, into a SQL database or maybe an external resource, you try to connect directly to this resource using maybe a string connection or maybe basic authentication like providing an user and a password. So as you can see on the screen, this is a very common example on the first one for a SQL database. And we usually provide some information like the server, the base database, the type of authentication we use a SQL password, and we provide a user ID and a password in this case. On the second example, this is a short abbreviation of a service bus in the Azure side, one of the resources that we are going to be exploring pretty soon. And if you get a string connection for a service bus, it is very common that you will see a domain with the service bus URL, and also you will be providing a key for the connection. The major problem with this kind of connections, as these examples are we are showing on screen, is that if an undesirable person gets access to one of these connection strings and we don't have like a proper networking setup, anyone will be able to access these resources and actually make a huge interaction with them. Usually for a service bus, for example, the default string connection, it will allow you to do a lot of things against them. So you will be able to pull messages, you will be able to retrieve messages. So that is actually a security concern. So let's suppose a developer leaves the company, and if this developer has access to this kind of connections and tooling, he will be able to access your resources even if he's outside of the corporation. This is taking into account that there are actually not only poor security configurations providing this string connection, but it's also a very weak networking strategy. So instead of trying to use a string connection where we provide keys and users and password and secrets and stuff like that, Azure provides a solution that is named Managed Identity. So a managed identity is going to be part of the Azure Active Directory, and is going to be a concept that is going to be always in the middle between one application and one of the resources. So following the example as before, if we have an API, the managed identity can help us out to get the proper set of permissions to access the SQL database. The managed identity is going to be a resource that is represented into the Azure side as something that only exists in the Azure portal and is only has the capability to access the resources that you have access to inside of the Azure definition. So that means in order to access any of the resources, the managed identity in this case is only going to work on applications deployed already in Azure. You could have something exactly similar using IAM, using for example your user and password, which is also tied into the Azure side, and you can provide role access control into this SQL database. So quite to the contrary, if a developer leaves the company and he used to have a Azure portal account and everything was handled using role-based access, as soon as we decommission that account, he will lose access to the resources, even if he knew the URL or maybe the server and everything. Since we are not using anything or open keys or a string connection with user and password anymore, he will not be able to access this. So if we come back to the previous example, this is like a string connection could look like if you're using a managed identity. So if you see in the first line, instead of providing a user and password, we actually provide just only the name of the service, the initial database, and we request the connection to be handled through our Active Directory on the Azure side. So this type of configuration will allow you to use your IAM account or your personal email, or grant access to other users that also belong to the Azure tenancy that you belong to. And also it's going to work for managed identities that are available in your scope as well. As long this is going to work as long as the managed identity or the IAM entity has the level of access. So if you want to have access into a SQL database, for example, you will need to have the writer permissions into the database or the reader permissions, or actually both if you are an application or maybe a more advanced user that need both operations. And also you will need to do some additional setups into the SQL side in order to grant access to that user. We might see those topics in later sessions. In the second example, it's even simpler. As you can see, you only need to provide the service bus connection and do a very specific configuration that we will do later into the code. You will need no longer to provide keys or passwords or anything like that to access the service bus. By just giving the whole domain, you will be able to access the resources as long as the entity that is representing you has access to those resources. One of the best things when you use a managed identity is that you will be able to segregate the permissions according to the requirements you would like to have. As you can see on screen, this is a very basic definition of what Azure has to offer usually. So you have a management group, which is the top tier of the definition. A management group will have multiple subscriptions, and each one of the subscriptions could have one or more resource groups that are treated individually to the application. So you see, resource group number 1, which belongs to the subscription number 1, has a key vault assigned to it. And if we move more to the right, subscription number 3 has access to the resource group number 3, and this one has a container app and a SQL database and a key vault application. One very practical example is that if you want your container app that is also part of the resource group, you want that container app to have access to the SQL database on the key vault, you can set in the middle a managed identity with the proper set of permissions, and that way the app that is deploying the container app will be able to access the resources without exposing any sensitive information. So in the next video, we will create a managed identity using the Azure CLI. We also are going to provide some basic RBAC configuration just to see how we can assign roles to this application. And together with it, we are going to be creating a key vault just to explore how the permissions work. We will do some initial testing locally using IAM. And after that, in the next session in AKS, we are going to be deploying an application that is going to have access to Service Bus, and it will be using the managed identity. Thank you then again for joining me today, and see you in the next lesson.